This is Sofia's daughter. So this is the first commercial module from Venom. There are so many great free modules in the Venom collection, and it's a great chance to support the development of Venom and to get such a unique module. This is of course the Sofia's daughter oscillator, which is inspired by the eurorack module Sofia from XAOC Devices. It can produce very unique sounds. There's also a recreation of this oscillator made by Venom with free available modules you can download and try. And let's start with an overview of the basic functionality. We have four sections. We have the so-called ripples, so ripple A and B. We have the fundamental section, and we have the global section. And the ripples are what makes this oscillator unique. They are sorts of bursts of audio synced to the fundamental and mixed with it. So if we take a look at ripple B, for example, you can see how it looks like. We get bursts of a sine wave in this case. We can change the frequency ratio of these bursts in relation to the fundamental. We can also control the envelope. We get even an envelope, a dedicated envelope output, a decay envelope. Right, so you can also change this. We can even warp the envelope or the wave itself. We have here the warp. If you right click this little button, we get all sorts of different modes. For example, we can warp the frequency. Right, we can warp the envelope. And again, all sorts of different wave shaping. And again, the ripples are synced to the fundamental. So if I change the frequency of the fundamental, also the frequency of the ripples will change. And as I mentioned, we get a mix of the fundamental and the ripples. So here we have the final mix output. Right, this is now the fundamental and both ripples. Right, so you can already see the potential of this module. Here I have, as an example, a sequence with slips. Let me just start the clock here. This sequence I will send to the volt per octave input of the fundamental section here. And for now I will use both A and B ripples as a stereo voice. This will go through a delay, through echo. For now I have the mix all the way down. Right, so I will take the A output and the B output as a stereo voice. Again, we have them panned left and right. Right, now already with simple modulation we can add lots of movements. I have here mod 7 from Cell, basically 7 LFOs, so I can modulate the decay of the envelopes of both ripples. Right, just a tiny bit, just to add some movement. Right, also the frequency ratio, of course. Right, also the warping, and again we can choose different modes. So let's say here, for example, it will modulate the envelope, and here it will warp, let's say, the wave itself. Right, just for adding movement. Even with basic modulation. Now we also get access to the fundamental sine wave, either saturated. You can see here we have fundamental saturated, and here we have saturation amount. Or we can get the pure sine wave. Right, so this can be a nice stable layer in comparison to the ripples. And now I can add delay just to the ripples. Again, we have only the ripples set or sent to the delay to echo. So I will take the mix all the way up. Right, so we have the sine wave as our bass, or bass voice, let's say. And then we have the ripples with the delay on top. Here I have also a bass voice, again with another Sofia's. Right, in this case I'm using the step sequencer to sequence it, and I'm using here the final mix output. Again, this will be a mix of the fundamental and the ripples. Right, so first of all, I can set the pitch or the pitch sequence to control the frequency ratio, right, of the ripples. Right, just by enabling track here, and also I can set this to the decay envelopes. Like this, they will also follow volt per octave. Right, again, just to change the sound a bit. In this case, I will use random modulation to modulate the warp. Right, we can also crossfade between the ripples. We have here ripple mix. Right, so A or B. Also this I can modulate. We can also crossfade between the listening just to the fundamental or just the ripples. So also this I can modulate. Right, now we also have the raw outputs of the ripples. This will be the ripples or the ripple elements before the envelope, so just the raw sound. In this case I will send them through Nimbus for some granulization. You can see this also here on the scope, how they look like. Right, again with the warping and everything, and you can see how many layers we get thanks to the different outputs. I have here just 2 instances of Sofia's daughter, and still we get such a lovely full sound. Something you definitely want to try early on is feedback modulation, basically using the various outputs to modulate different parameters. So here again I have a sequence with slips. I'm using here the final mix output. This is going through a chorus. For now the chorus but is all the way down. Right, so what we can do, for example, is use the raw output of ripple A to modulate the phase of ripple B. We have phase modulation. Right, already I recommend experimenting with the oversampling. We have here oversampling options, just to see if you prefer a cleaner sound. Right, with audio rate modulation you might get aliasing, maybe you like it, maybe not, but we have built-in oversampling here. Right, and now we can turn this into something a bit more dynamic by modulating the modulation depth. So I'm going to send this output first through a VCA. I have here the VCA mix also from Venom, and then I can modulate the amplitude with an LFO, for example, and we have dynamic audio rate modulation. Right, now I can use the raw output of the B ripple to modulate, for example, the warp of the A ripple, and again like this we have feedback modulation, A modulating B, B modulating A. So let's have a listen to this. Right, and again I can choose a different mode. Like this one, and again we can turn this into something more dynamic by sending this through a VCA first and controlling the VCA, for example, with an LFO. Now we can also use the fundamental for this. So for example, the raw output can modulate the frequency ratio of ripple A, and again we can do this dynamically with the VCA. And the saturated output can modulate the frequency of ripple B. Right, so everything is modulating everything, and again dynamically through a VCA. And everything stays musical and really nice. Lots of textures. Now we can also change the waveforms of the ripples to get something with a bit more of an edge. Right, we have a sine wave, or a triangle, or a square. I will go with a square. And then finally add the chorus to it. Very nice. Right, so we get a nice full of movement sound. For adding a bit more punch, I will use an envelope to control the element mix. Right, I have here an envelope being triggered by the same sequencer. Right, so maybe something like this. Right, and we have also FM here on the global section. This will modulate the frequency of both the fundamental and the ripples. So I will use the envelope to control this as well. Again, just to add a bit more of a punch. Now this becomes so much more fun when you start processing the signals before using them for modulation. Right, so here I just have a drone. Again, with Sofia's daughter, I'm using here the fundamental raw as my center voice, and then I'm mixing both ripples as a left and right voice, right, to get a bit of stereo. And now I will use again the B raw output to modulate, in this case, the phase of the fundamental. Also here we have phase modulation, but first of all, I will send it through a wave folder. I have here the wave folder from Venom. Right, so we can process things before using them for modulation. And again, also here we can have this a bit more dynamic by modulating the wave folder. I have here caudal from Volt, can modulate the wave folding and the bias. Right, so we get something a bit more interesting. I can use also the final mix to modulate the warp of both ripples, and I will use in this case the wave multiplier, also from Venom, and it has different outputs here, wave outputs. I will use the final mix, process it with the wave multiplier, and then use two waves to modulate the warp. Right, and again we can use, very nice, we can use also different modes. This here. Maybe this one here. And again, everything is modulating everything. The final mix is modulating the ripples, which are also in the mix with the VCA mix for stereo, also from Venom. Now we can also use external sources, of course, for modulation, for audio rate modulation. I have here two VCO units, also from Venom. I will use them to modulate the frequency of both ripples, right? The frequency ratio of A and B, again at audio rates. Right, also the level here I'm modulating with, maybe I can bring this in a bit, here with caudal. Right, so again we have lots and lots of movement. This just needs a nice melody. I have here another Sofia's. Right, also here I'm using feedback modulation, I'm using thorns to process the modulation, reformation. Right, this is being sequenced by the phrase sequencer. We also get both hard and soft sync, which is great for all sorts of sound design ideas. Here again I have just a drone. The reverb and distortion for now are not really doing anything. But I have here two VCO units that I will use to sync Sofia, right, once through the hard sync, once through soft sync. Right, so we have hard and soft sync at the same time. Now I can add some modulation. So for example, I can modulate the phase of the VCO units. Again, I have here caudal for smooth random modulation. I can modulate the phase of Sofia, so the fundamental, and also the ripple elements. Right, I can modulate also the frequency of Sofia via the FM input. Right, and also the frequency ratio separately with different modulation sources of the both ripples. Right, I can add now some reverb and distort the reverb or distortion after the reverb. Very nice. Right, now another way of using sync is with the one-shot modes. Right, here again I'm using the ripples as a stereo voice. Let me solo this. Right, but now I will activate the one-shot modes that we have here. And now only when we send a signal to the hard sync input, we will get a one-shot cycle. And this works really well with the ripples since they have their own envelopes, so we get nice percussive voices. Here I have a Euclidean sequencer that I will use to trigger the hard sync. Right, and again we can change the decay of the ripples. I have them in different frequency ratios. Right, we can also modulate this, of course. I have here an LFO. I can also modulate the warp to change the sound. Right, so you get even percussive voices without any need of external VCAs or anything, or envelopes. We have everything built in. I will add some delay to this. Now we can also use the envelopes themselves. Again, we have dedicated envelope outputs. Here I have another VCO unit, and I will mix both envelopes, once normal, once inverted, to get an interesting shape, and this will bring in the VCO unit. Right, so we have the envelope of A. I'm using here the quad voltage controlled polarizer, also from Venom, to mix them and also to invert the B envelope, and you can see the result here on the scope. Right, so this brings in the VCO unit. And the one-shot modes work great also at audio rates. Right, so here again I have another Sofia's daughter. It's already set to one-shot mode. As you can see, I have lots and lots of modulation already set here with caudal. Right, and in this case, instead of triggering the hard sync, I will run it at audio rates with another VCO unit. Right, and there's a sequence here with a step sequencer, some delay with echo. I hope you could already see that there's a lot more to explore with Sofia's daughter, and I want to quickly show you a few more things. So first of all, of course, this module is polyphonic. You can use it to play chords, for example. Here I have a 7-note chord with harmony too. And of course, now we can also modulate things polyphonically, so each voice gets its own modulation. I have here the quad LFO from Surge XT. I have it set to 7 channels of polyphony, so each channel, each voice will get its own modulation, for example, for the warp, for the ripple mix, right? The frequency ratio of the second ripple here. Right, and again, this is now polyphonic with 7 channels of polyphony. We can also just have the ripples polyphonic. Here it's playing a one-note drone, right? It's basically monophonic. There is just one note playing. But I have here polyphonic modulation with the mod 7 from Chords. You can set it to be polyphonic. Here I have both of them set to 4 channels of polyphony. So if I modulate the warp of both ripples, now just the ripples are polyphonic. The fundamental is basically the same. We have 4 channels of the same fundamental, but the ripples are now polyphonic. We have 4 different ripples going on. Right, so you can use polyphony for adding more layers and more textures, even without using chords or polyphonic sequences. Another interesting idea is to use Sofia's at lower rates, generating various rhythms. So here I'm using the ripples as a stereo voice, right? A and B. And I will take the frequency of the fundamental down quite a bit. Right, already we get a sort of a rhythm. Now I can use the envelope, for example, as a clock source to clock a sequencer. I have here the step sequencer 8, also from Chords. Right, and now we can sequence things. So for example, I can sequence the frequency of the ripples. Right, I can sequence their decay. And I can even create wonky rhythms by sequencing the frequency of the fundamental. Right, so using this at lower rates can also yield interesting results. And this can be also quite interesting with polyphony. Here I'm using just one of the ripples, ripple A. Right, the frequency is already quite down. Maybe I will change this to a triangle. Right, but the frequency is quite down, so we get this rhythm. Right, but now I will offset the frequency on 3 different channels. I'm using here the poly offset from Venom, set to 3 channels of polyphony. Right, so 3 channels, each of them will be a bit different. Right, now just let me take this a bit up. Now just to reset everything, I can use here a trigger through the hard sync. So now they are all in sync, all 3 voices. Right, and I can also offset the frequency of the ripples. I have here another poly offset. Right, so you get a sort of a chord, because now again we have 3 ripples, each of them with a different rhythm and a different frequency. And I can even turn this into something a bit more percussive with the warp. Right, change the overall frequency here with the fundamental. Right, something like this. Now you should definitely experiment also with FM. There are 3 FM modes. Let me unmute this. Right, we have here FM for the fundamental or the global that will control also the ripples. If you right click this button, you can see the modes. We have exponential, linear, which is linear through 0, by the way, AC coupled or DC coupled. Right, so you can really create. This is exponential. This is, again, linear through 0. And we have again AC coupled or DC coupled. And that's it. I really hope you will consider getting this module, and I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you again for watching. Cheers.